Welcome to Sewing with Sandy. Today we're going to do Vogue 9199. It's a super easy pattern. It's a princess seam, high-low dress. I'm going to do 3/4 sleeves and it has a nice scoop neck. Now, princess seams are perfect for fitting. They give you lots of opportunities to tweak the fit so you get it just right. And then this super scoop neck is really cute, and then the high-low. Now, we made a 3/4 sleeve instead of the short sleeve. This comes with a short and a long, and I didn't want either, so I did a 3/4 sleeve, and I have this Nicole Miller fabric that has been in my stash from Joann's, and it's a scuba, so it's super stretchy. And I fussy cut the sleeves and I extended them so they're just like 3/4 length, right? So that it makes it multi-seasonal. It gives you an opportunity to wear it in the summer, like springtime, early fall, all winter, and yeah, so I love a 3/4 sleeve. So that we're going to do, and then it's princess seams. It's pretty easy. We're going to talk about putting in sleeves on a flat garment. Now, I had this fabric in my stash for a really long time and I wanted to use it, and of course I didn't have enough. I'm the queen of not having enough fabric. So the front and the sleeves of my dress I made with the Nicole Miller. The back, the center back and the two side back pieces are made with a black ponte that I had in my stash. That's perfectly fine. You see these dresses all over the place like that. If I'd had enough, I would have done as much as I could. I ended up with this little teeny tiny scrap when I was left over, so that's good because there's zero waste. And I always keep this black ponte in my stash because it's just so easy to use. It goes with everything and it works really well. Say you have a little silk and you only have enough for the front, the black ponte on the back, and you're good to go. So yeah, let's get started with Vogue 9199. We're going to start with piece 1, which is the center front, and we're going to stay stitch right along this curvy edge here. And the reason for that is to keep the fabric from stretching beyond where it's supposed to be, because we have a concave seam and we're going to be sewing another seam to it. So I want to make sure that this is stitched just to give it some structure. So stay stitching is just a straight stitch in the seam allowance on a single layer. So I'm just going to take this to the machine and I'm going to stitch along this curve on both sides. All right, here you can see, because I used black thread on the back, I've just run this seam along the side where it's curvy, and it's taken all the stretch out of the seam. So that's really important. So now it won't stretch out of shape as I sew the other pieces to it. And our next step is to sew the two side fronts. So that would be piece 2. We're going to lay them out. Again, I like to lay everything out the way it's going to look when it's finished. So these pieces line up like so. So here is my center front. Here's my neck edge. There's a big scoop neck. This is part of my armhole, and this matches up down here. All right, so the seam on this princess seam goes into the armhole. You can see with the green version, you can see how it goes into the armhole opening. So you want to make sure that you sew them that way. So once I have my pieces laid out in front of me, I'm just going to flip them over and line them up. And you can see we have a convex and a concave seam that we're going to sew together. And I like to pin my lower edge piece, pin at the top, and then I'm going to pin at the bottom. And if we cut our pieces out correctly, we should be in good shape. You don't want to get to the bottom and then have it not match. And this has this very deep curvy curve going on. You know, I actually shortened this pattern, and when you shorten a pattern that has, when you always shorten a pattern, not only when it has an interesting hem, but whenever you shorten a pattern, you should shorten it up above the hemline So in this particular case, I shortened it. There was a shortened line here below the waistline because I wanted to shorten the hip length. So I shortened it a good 4 inches. And I just folded my pattern and taped off 4 inches. And then recut these side pieces so that they're nice and smooth. Right? Because when you shorten it, it looks a little funky. So I'm going to see how well we did. Just going to throw a few pins up here from the bottom. That looks pretty good. And now I have this convex and concave seam. And you know, it just takes a few pins. I'm just going to carefully pin this. And since we've stay stitched this edge, we won't be stretching it out. We'll make it fit the way it's supposed to fit as opposed to stretching it into shape. And look at that, that's perfect. Absolutely perfect. You know, a good Vogue pattern is almost always well drafted, and it makes all the difference in the world. So I'm going to stitch this, and I'm going to do the same thing to the other side. When we come back, our front will be assembled. This has a 5/8 inch seam allowance on it, and also I'm going to use a jersey needle and the stretch stitch on my sewing machine. So check your manufacturer's instructions and find your stretch stitch on it, or if you have a serger that stitches and overlocks at the same time, that's certainly another great option. Right? How's that, huh? Look at that. Our front's sewn together. You can see what I kind of ran out of fabric because I fussy cut this knot all the way down the center front because I wanted that nice linear line. I didn't worry about the sides too much, but I did pattern match them each to each other. There's a lot of pattern going on here. And there's a very severe scoop in the front of this. You sewed these in. If you're struggling with getting your seams even, put the curved part down by the feed dogs and it will help you along. And I sewed, here is what my stretch stitch looks like on my machine. It's like a super baby zigzag. And I used black because on this side I didn't want to see any white stitches. I used white on my overlocker to overlock this. And I'll have to use black because the back of my dress is black, and since you can see from the front to the back, right down here, you're going to see the inside. So I want to make sure that it's all nice and neat. So I'll have to switch my overlocker to black thread, which is not fun, but that will happen. So the front is finished, and I'm going to do the same thing with the back. I'm going to take the center back, stay stitch the side edges, add the sides to it, and then we're going to put them together. The pattern instructions do call for reinforcing the shoulders. I've never had an issue with that. I don't do it. Certainly you can feel free to do it. This has a pretty stable knit if you were using something super floppy, but even with t-shirts, I don't stabilize the shoulders. I think they're perfectly fine. And we're going to finish off the back and then sew the front and back together at the shoulders because we're going to insert our sleeves flat instead of doing a insert, you know, a set-in sleeve. We're going to set them in flat because you can do that with a knit and it works out beautifully. So we're going to do that next. So get your back pieces sewn together and then sew everything together at the shoulder, and we will meet back up to put in sleeves. All right, we're going to sew this princess seam. Now I'm going to set my machine on my knit stitch, and I'm going to set my stitch at about 3, and then I've pinned this so the real curvy part is at the bottom, so my feed dogs will help me move that along. And this is going to be stitched at 5/8 of an inch. Now I want you to think about, you don't want to, you can see there's a notch here, right? There's a little notch here, so that's where we're going to begin. That notch goes into the seam, so that gives us this smooth opening here, right, for the sleeve, for the neckline. That's the sleeve, yeah, so for the sleeve. You don't want to start right at the edge when you're sewing. You want to start in a little bit, and then you can back up to the edge and come forward. But this ponturoma is heavy, so it's fine. But if you have a lighter weight fabric, if you start right at the edge, sometimes your needle can just jam that fabric right down into your throat plate, and then you have a hot mess, which you don't want to deal with. So I start a little bit further down, sink my needle. We don't want to, we're sewing at a regular stitch, so we don't want to sew over our pins. Get my petal here. And I want to keep these edges matched up. Forward a little bit, backward a little bit, and then forward. And this knit stitch takes a little while because it's stitching like a lightning bolt, right? But I'm going to stop and start because I want to get a smooth curve, and I can feel that with my fingers. I know it's going to be smooth. I want to make sure my edges matched up. You know, if you have one edge piece that's pushed way over, that's going to change the size of your garment. I mean, your garment is made so that that both pieces have a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, and you want to do your best to keep it that way, because if you make it bigger than 5/8 or smaller than 5/8, then it's going to change the size of your garment. So you can see I'm going slow because I want to go around that curve, and I don't want any puckers or pleats in the bottom of my fabric. I want to make sure the edges are lined up. Princess seams are not a fast process. They do take a minute. So now I'm going by that stay stitching, and you can see why we kept that inside the seam allowance, because we don't want to have to rip it out. That would be miserable. Okay, we have stitched the princess seams in our front. Let's lay this out here. Here we go. So here is our neckline for the front piece, right? And then we stitch the princess seams for the back. It's a lot of dress, huh? And we're going to lay them right sides together, and we're going to stitch these shoulder seams. So I'm just going to pin these together. And then we'll talk about the neckline. So the next step is the neckline, and you have a couple of options. The pattern recommends a bias binding, a purchased bias binding, which is stiff for a knit dress, and I don't think that it's the best option when you're working with something that is soft. I think the bias binding that you buy is just too stiff for doing a neck edge. So I'm going to sew these shoulder seams on, and then I'm going to stay stitch this neck edge, which is just a single row of stitching within the seam allowance. And you want to think about how you're going to finish this before you sew the stay stitching on. So you have a couple of options. You can, and I'm going to flip it over so we're looking at the white side, it'll be a little easier. You can turn this. You can do, because it's knit, you can serge all the way around the edge or finish off the edge and turn it and top stitch it. That's one option. You can add a store-bought bias tape. I would totally suggest that you do not do that. If you're going to put bias tape on it, go ahead and cut your own. Either use the fashion fabric or the black fabric. Either one will be fine. You just cut it at a 45-degree angle. We have videos showing you how to do that. This is stretchy, and you can apply the bias binding tape, and that's another option. And you can add it so you see the bias tape, or you can add it so it goes inside. On here they show it so it's applied. You can see, let me just check to make sure that that is the case. And this turns it all into the inside, and then you top stitch it. So you can see that there's top stitching along here on the drawing, and also, I mean, yes, on the drawing. They're both drawings. And So that's an option, and the neckline is going to change. The dimensions of the neckline are going to change. If you have an exposed binding, if you turn this under 1/4 of an inch, you serge off 1/8 of an inch, and then you turn this under 1/4 of an inch, that's going to make the neckline bigger. If you apply bias binding and you leave a trim of bias binding on there, that's going to make the neckline smaller. So you want to try this on and think about how you're going to apply the tape that the finishing edge that you're going to put on this, and whether or not you want this neckline this size. I'm going to use fold over elastic, and what that is just stretchy elastic, and it's got a little crease on the inside, in the middle, right? So you can fold it over, and that gets applied over the edge. So if I try this on and I'm happy with the way this neckline looks the way it is, because this binding folds to the back and you stitch it on. So you stitch it on so it just covers the raw edge up, and we'll show you how to do that. But I just want you to think about how you're going to finish the neck edge, because you have lots of really good options, and that's the next step. But if you're going to put bias fold over elastic on the neck edge, you can see how narrow this is, right? You don't want a 5/8 or 1/2 inch stay stitching on your neck edge, because you're going to have to pick it out. So something to think about. Okay, we have sewn together our shoulder seams, and now we need to finish off our neck edge. And there's a couple of ways you can finish off a knit neck edge. You can serge it and just turn it under, overcast it and turn it under, or finish it and turn it under. I wouldn't do a double fold because you're going to get crinkles, but certainly you can get away with one fold. The disadvantage to that is that the knit will stretch. There's nothing to support it, and it's going to eventually stretch out of shape. So that's not ideal. The pattern calls for a bias binding, purchased bias binding, which I find to be a little stiff. You have this really nice soft flowy knit, and then you add a binding to it that's going to stiffen it up. So even though it's bias binding, it's still stiff. If you want to use a bias binding, then I suggest you cut one out of the knit fabric. I'll link below how to make bias binding, and then applying it is the same method as we're going to use. We're going to use fold over elastic, but bias binding is essentially the same, and you can set the bias binding so it's inside and you don't see it, or you can set the bias binding so you end up with a little edge, like a t-shirt edge. So those are a couple of different options. And for this, I mean, if you wanted to do it in the black, it would bring the black around the front. I'm going to capture that same method with fold over elastic, and it's stretchy, and it has a little ridge right down the middle. So you literally, it folds in half. And essentially what it does is it covers the edge of your garment like that. So it covers it on the inside and the outside. So you want to try this on, because this neck edge isn't going to get any larger when you apply this elastic. So if the neck edge is too big, then you want to do a bias binding that makes the neckline a little smaller, right? The bias binding that kind of sticks out as a trim edge, right? If the neckline is too small, then you might either trim it and apply fold over elastic, or put a bias binding on that will turn this under, and then that will make the neck edge larger. So a lot of that is just style. But today we're going to explore the world of fold over elastic. Simply, we want to make a piece of elastic that's going to fit our neckline. So this is how we're going to do it. We're going to start at our shoulder seam, and I'm just going to pin it, and I'm going to pin it about a 1/2 inch beyond my shoulder seam, because that is going to be my seam allowance. So here's my shoulder seam, and then I am going to gently walk this piece of fold over elastic all the way around my neck edge. I'm not stretching the fabric, and I'm not stretching the fold over elastic. So we want to see how big the neck edge is. You could use a measuring tape, certainly. I find this is faster. It's more accurate because I'm doing it right on the garment. I'm not stretching it. I'm going to go all the way around the whole neck edge right back to where I had my first pin. All right. You have to do it in little increments because it's curvy, right? So I've come to my first pin, and I want to make sure that I add a seam allowance to this piece, so I'm going to make this a 1/2 inch bigger. So now I know how big my elastic piece is for my neckline, and I'm just going to cut it at this pin here. So I have a piece of elastic that is the same length as my neckline, plus a 1/2 inch on each end for seam allowance. So let's see how big that is. That is, without stretching it, I'm going to run it on the ruler, and it is 38 inches. So considering I left a 1/2 inch for my seam allowance, the neck edge is 37 inches. That's a really big neck. And what you want to do when you put in fold over elastic or bias binding is you want to kind of shrink the neckline. You want the neckline to sit flush against your body. So in order to do that, you need to kind of tighten in the fabric. So to do that, we want to make this piece of elastic smaller than the neck edge. And my rule of thumb is 1 inch smaller for every 10 inches of neck edge. So this is 37 inches long. I'm going to take off 4 inches off of this piece. So I'm going to go to my 4 inches on my ruler, and I'm just going to lop off 4 inches. Now, if I wanted to save this 4 inches, I would use a ruler, I would use a measuring tape around my neck edge, and then determine how big I actually need to cut my fold over elastic. But you know, we're talking a couple of pennies here, so I'm good with that. Well, the next thing I want to do is I want to, without twisting my fold over elastic, I want to bring the edges together and stitch them across so I have one big loop. After I do that, we'll come back and we'll talk about assembling the neck edge. All right, now we have our full circle piece. It's not twisted, which is good, for a nice stretchy elastic. Now we want to sew this on in quadrants. So the stretch that we're taking in, or the reduction of the neck edge, is even all the way around. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to find the center front of the neck edge and the center back. So here's my neck hole opening, and I'm going to pin my shoulder seams together. And for this type of application, I like to have my seams open, so I won't overlock them because I want them to be open. I'm applying something on top of them, and it's too thick if I have multiple layers. Now my shoulder seams are pinned together just temporarily, and I'm going to walk the front of my garment edges together to come up with my center front. And in this case, because it's a pattern, I already know where my center front is because it's the center. I centered this pattern when I cut it out, so that's my center front. And I'm going to do the same thing with the center back. I'm going to walk the neck edges of the back to find the center back. I'm going to unpin the shoulders. Now you would think that the quadrants would be center front, center back, and shoulder seams. But if you look at this piece, this length of neck edge is way longer than this length of neck edge. So these shoulder seams can't possibly be our fourth quadrants. So what we're going to do is we're going to put the center front and center back pins together. And I'm going to add a third pin in there just temporarily to hold them in place. And just like we did with the center front and the center back, we're going to walk the seam allowances together without stretching them to find the next quadrant. And you can see that it's quite a bit far away from the shoulder seam. and that's because the run of the front neckline is longer than the run of the back neckline. So I'm going to do the same thing with the other side. I'm just going to run my raw edges together, and then I can take this holding pin out, making sure that I don't lose my center front and center back pins. Now my neck edge is divided into even quadrants. So I have center front, side front, center back, and another side front over here. Now I want to do the same thing with my fold over elastic ring. I want this seam allowance to end up somewhere around here. Probably not on the shoulder seam because it's way too much bulk, but somewhere in the back around here. I certainly don't want it in the center front. So I'm going to kind of guess that this will be the center front and the center back. So I'm just going to fold it in half and pin it in the center back, and then I'm going to make sure it's nice and even and not twisted, and put a pin in for the center front. And then just like we did with the garment, we're going to match up those two pins. Just anchor them in place for the time being, and find our other quadrants. And I can take out this holding pin. So now our band is also in quadrants of 4. And if I match up, I can play with this a little bit. If I match up this seam here, this seam allowance is sort of here on the neckline, so I'm good with that. So now what I want to do is pin my quadrants together. And remember, this folds, so I'm going to pin it folded. So I'm going to line up one of my quadrant pins and fold the elastic and pin it down. Just so I know that that's a quadrant. That has to stay there. The elastic has to meet to that section. And I'm going to go to my center front, and I'm going to match up my two quadrants. Again, I'm just going to kind of fold my elastic in half and pin it there. It's a little fiddly. And you can see that this quadrant here, the elastic is smaller than the neck opening. And that's what we want, because we want the elastic to kind of suck that in. So as we take it to the machine, and I'll show you how to stitch it, we're going to fold this over, stitch it, and kind of tug on the elastic at the same time as we're stitching, so we get it all to meet together. Now, if this seems like too big of a span for you, you can find the center of this and the center of this and make it in, put it in on an eighths, and then you're only dealing with a little tiny bit. But you have to stretch this without stretching this while you're stitching it. It's a little bit of a knack. I suggest you practice before you do it on your finished garment, because it is a little tricky, and you want to make sure that you don't stitch this together and not catch the dress. The dress has to be, or the neckline has to be encased inside there, so you have to catch that with the stitches. That takes a little practice, but you can do it. I'm confident. All right, so here we are. I have fed my dress through the machine. You want it as flat as possible, and you also don't want it hanging down off the edge, because the weight of the fabric, if it's hanging down off the edge, will drag, and it will make it more difficult for you to sew this. So I'm going to line up my first spot. I'm going to start right here at my first quadrant pin, and I'm just going to pin it so it's folded over. So starting is a little tricky. Before I start stretching this, I'm going to get a good stitch in here. Now, you know, part of the reason this is a little difficult is because you're only using, it's so narrow, you're only using one feed dog. And if you have a left edge stitch, if you can move your needle to the left, it will help you a little bit because you get a little bit more traction from the feed dog. But once my needle is in there, I'm just going to regroup everything. And I'm not going to pull on it yet because I want to get an anchor stitch or two in there just to get me started. All right, now I can take this pin out. Now I want to get to this next pin down here, which is my next quarter stitch. And you can see I just need to stretch this a little bit. So I'm going to slide my fabric in between, give this a little tug, give I'm going to slide my fabric in between where the fold is, and I'm going to give the fold over elastic a little tug, and then I'm going to hold it as I stitch it. And I think my stitch is a little too small. Whoop. There we go. Increase my stitch a little bit. So I'm at a 2.8. And this is a start and stop process. All right, so if you have a needle down machine, that's fabulous. If you don't, you need to stop with your needle down in the machine every time because it will make your, it will keep your fabric in place, which is important. So see, I'm almost at this pin here. I'm just going to regroup this pin and make sure that it's stuck in there well. And you can see I'm doing pretty well on my, you're going around a curve, you're stretching the elastic, you're holding it down, you're sewing something that's super skinny. It takes a little bit of time and a little bit of practice. You almost need like another hand. But because this goes around your face, you want to take your time and make sure that it looks good. And if you miss a little bit, well, then you just go back and fix it. That's, in this case, it's black on black. You can find a lot of these colored fold over elastics at M&J. I'll put their link in the write-up. M&J Trimming in New York, they have a nice selection of fold over elastics. All right, so I've made it to that first quadrant pin, and I'm just going to go through the rest of the neck edge and do the other 3 quadrants the same way I did the first one. All right, and there you have it. Our beautiful neck edge is finished. We have this really nice stretchy neck edge, but it has some resistance, right? It goes back. None of our stay stitching shows. Perfect. So we're really happy with that. Now, in this pattern, they talk about doing set-in sleeves, which is totally not necessary when you are making a knit garment. We can do a flat sleeve, and I'm going to show you how to do that. However, because I have this beautiful scuba and I wanted to match up my sleeves, so I wanted to pattern match them, I ran out of pattern. I ran out of fabric. In order to kind of coordinate the back to the front, I would add a cuff onto the bottom of my sleeve. And what this is going to do is actually hem the sleeve so I don't have to hem it myself. Okay, right? I'm going to fold this rectangle. It's just a rectangle, so this makes it's a little bit longer than the full sleeve. So if I fold this up, this is the length of the full sleeve. So I lopped a little bit off the bottom, and I'm going to make this cuff that's going to go on here. So I'm going to fold this right sides together and apply it to the bottom of each one of my sleeves. And that's going to do a couple of things. It's going to give me this really nice band at the bottom, and it's going to hem it at the same time. Right, so once I stitch that, this is what the sleeve is going to look like. Doesn't that look great? and it ties the front and the back together, so it gives it something that's a little more stylized. Now my pieces seem to be my rectangles are a little long, so I'll just trim those down after I sew it. But I'm going to add the rectangles to the bottom, and then we're going to come back and put in knit sleeves before we sew the side seams. So don't sew the side seams. We're going to put the knit sleeves in, and then we're going to sew it up the side and down the sleeve, and voila, our sleeves are hemmed, our neckline's done. The only thing left to do on the dress is to hem it, and we will be finished. You will be so happy with this dress when you get it done. I'm loving it. All right, I sewed my banding on to the bottom of my sleeve, and you can see I used my knit stitch, so it's nice and stretchy. You don't want to use a straight stitch. It will pop for sure. And then when I press this, I want to press this up towards the top of the sleeve because there's a lot of bulk there. Now, I did mention that these were a little long, that these bands were a little long. Literally, I'm just going to trim them down. It's not going to be an issue. We have this big thing that looks like a flag now, right? We have our dress front, and our sleeves are sewn on, and they look beautiful. Press the seams towards the sleeve, which gives you a really nice sleeve cap. All right, we have 2 more seams to do, and then the hem. So now what we're going to do is we're going to fold the dress in on itself, right sides together. And we have this long side seam. So we're going to start with the underarm seam. That's the most important seam because we want to make sure that that seam lines up beautifully, right? Especially since we have different fabrics on the front and the back. So we're going to pin that underarm seam. Then I'm going to come down here and I'm going to pin my cuff at the edge. And I'm also going to make sure that my cuff seams line up really well because I want that, that's a look, right? I want that to look beautiful. And then I'm just going to throw another pin in here so it doesn't slide around. And I'm going to go all the way down to the hemline and pin the hem edges together. And then just pin up the side. And they should meet. Hopefully they will meet perfectly. If they don't, I might cry a little. But we pin them because, like we discussed, the feed dogs move the bottom piece faster than the top piece and add some ease. So did you ever get to the bottom of the hem without pinning it and one piece was this much longer than the other? That's because the feed dogs had sucked all of that up. So the pinning helps that. Look at that, fits perfectly. So now I'm going to sew all the way down the arm and all the way down the side. And that's perfect. We are good to go. So at some point in your sewing career, you are going to make dresses and you're going to be like, it's close, but it's not quite right. And this is one of those dresses. Even though I shortened the pattern through here, I probably could have taken it up a little bit through here, which I'm not going to do because it will destroy this really nice pattern going on the front, which I love. So it's definitely too long. And I'm going to cut about 2 inches off the bottom of the hem, and that will bring it up and that will lighten it up a little bit because right now it's pretty heavy. The other thing is the sleeves, the cuff is not the right balance on the sleeves. I didn't cut that right, and the sleeves are really too long. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to shorten them. So I'm going to take the cuff off. I need to make it smaller. I think it probably needs to be, and this is, you know, we're doing our own dressing yourself by yourself, right? Measuring yourself by yourself. I think it needs to be about half the size of what it is right now. So if I make the cuff half the size, the sleeve is still not quite right. Now it's in this weird place right between my wrist and the crux of my arm. So I'm going to shorten the sleeve. And these are all things that you can do after the garment is made. There are certain things you can't do after the garment's made, but this is certainly something that you can take care of. I'm going to take this cuff off and I'll show you how to put one back on, which is just as easy. We've done bands before, as opposed to sewing it onto the bottom. So I think if I look at that, just disregard this in the back here. So see how much better this looks than this long sleeve coming down at me? So I took 2 inches off the cuff and another, maybe 4 inches off the sleeve. So now it's a 3/4 sleeve. And if I lift this up 2 inches from the bottom, I'm going to hem it from the bottom. But all of a sudden my dress is more proportioned and I don't look like I'm wearing some kind of Halloween costume, right? So I want something that looks like a dress, not like a costume, and also something that fits really well. The rest of the dress fits great. I'm really happy with the way it fits in the front and in the back. It all looks terrific. I'm liking the black, and I'm liking the black neckline and also the black on the cuff. It's just too much. It's just too much fabric. It's weighing me down, and I want to lighten it up a little bit. So I'm going to cut 2 inches off the bottom, try it back on again, see if I like it. I might have to go back and cut another 1 or 2 inches off, but I want to make sure that I don't cut too much off right at the get-go. And then I'm going to show you how to fix this sleeve. You know, we're going to salvage this dress, and the dress is going to be great. It just isn't quite what we had envisioned when we first started to make it, or when I first started to make it. So let's get on to the sleeves and see how we do with that. All right, we're going to start with the sleeve. I'm going to turn it inside, right, and I'm going to cut off this binding, and I am just going to cut it off. And you can measure this, you can draw a line. I'm just going to cut it off. I cut off my sleeve binding and I evened out my sleeve, and I want to go back to this piece that I pinned up while I had it on and measure to see how much I short. I'm going to take off 1.5 inches off of this sleeve, and there's a couple of ways you can do this. Obviously you can take a ruler and draw a line. I just put pins. I want to take off 1.5 inches, so I'm putting a pin just above the 1.5 inch mark with my handy dandy little ruler. Now, you want to make sure you don't cut the same sleeve twice. So I just leave the pins in there after I cut it. I'm just going to cut just south of the pins. There we go. We're going to explore another method of putting on your cuff. As you go through the video, you'll find out that I decided the sleeves were too long and actually cut this cuff off. Now, what we're going to do now that we have the sleeve, I shorten the sleeve quite a bit, and I want to add, I still want that cuff, I just want it smaller, and I shortened the sleeve. So the sleeve may be a different measurement at this length, you know, since it's been shortened. So you want to measure your banding and make sure it's as long as your sleeve plus your seam allowance. Don't forget to use your stretch stitch. So I've sewed this piece, new piece together. This piece is 4 3/4 inches long. So I figured I wanted something about 1.5 inches, 1 3/4 with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. So now that I have this band, I'm going to fold. I'm going to open up my seam allowance so I don't have so much bow. Essentially, we're doing the same thing that we did with the original band, but the original band is attached to the sleeve, where this one, before we sew up the side seam, where this one is going to go on after we sewed up the side seam. So there's pluses and minuses to both. So now I have this band folded in half, wrong sides together, they're on the inside. You could stitch this if you're uncomfortable adding this on, but what I'm going to do is find my seam, and I'm just going to slide it over the right side of my sleeve. I like to match up this underarm seam and this band seam here. I want to have a good match on that. Try to get them as close as possible. And I'm going to pin that all the way around, making sure that I catch both pieces of the band and the sleeve in my seam allowance. So what's going to happen when I sew this on, my sleeve, my band will just turn down and it'll be completely attached. So that is a simple way to put on a band. It's another alternative to having sewn it on before I sew up the sleeve seam. I also decided to shorten this dress 2 inches. And again, as we did with the cuff, you can take your ruler and just draw a line 2 inches all the way around and trim it up 2 inches, or 2 inches. So, or you can pin it. There's a lot of different options. It's a little curvy, so it's a little hard to do with a rotary cutter and a straight ruler. Because it is curvy, you kind of want to go with the curves. So I'm going to trim this up. Now, this dress is super long. I went back and checked my pattern piece, and I shortened this dress. I'm going to measure this to, I already shortened it 4 inches. Now I'm 5'2.5", 5'3", and I shortened it 4 inches already, and I need to shorten it another 2 inches. So that's 6 inches. So the fit model from this dress must be very tall, because you can see from the drawing, the rendition, it's mid-calf, almost just below her knee, and it was way longer than that on me. So I'm going to take 2 inches off and try it back on again to see if the length works for me. I trimmed the hem 2 inches. I tried it on and it looks great, so it's the right length for me. So I'm going to do a little turned hem on the bottom, just a small hem. I'm going to sew these on, and our dress 91.99 is done, and I'm so excited. We saved it from sitting in the scrap pile by shortening it and taking care of the sleeves a little bit. All right, thank you for joining us on this Vogue 9199 sew along. I had a great time making this dress. We had some challenges. I shortened it 4 inches before I cut it out and then put it on, and it was way too long, so I shortened it another 2 inches. So I'm about 5'2". I ended up shortening it 6 inches, so you can keep that in mind as you make the dress going forward. It's a really nice length. It hits you kind of mid-calf with the high-low, and then down to the top of your shoe in the back, which is really a nice look, very feminine. It's not too dressy with the scuba knit, but it's dressy enough. We did the fold over elastic around the neck, which is great, and then we did the bands on the sleeves 2 different ways because we had to shorten them because they were too long. So I want you to think about fixing a garment before you actually finish it. Try it on. Don't throw it away. See if there's something you can do to fix it instead of giving up on it. And that's what we did with this one, and I love this dress. It is so cute. It's super comfy, and it's very flattering. Princess seams with that nice vertical seam is perfect for just about anybody. So I want you to consider that and give Vogue 9199 a try. Thanks for visiting, and I hope you can subscribe to our channel, give us a thumbs up. Anything that you're interested in is in the comments down below. You can link to the post that has all of the data and information that you need to find whatever we talked about in the video. So until next time, happy sewing. Bye.